The March options paper is in the public domain. You can get it on the internet. I'm not certain offhand whether or not it has been declassified.
Well, maybe I'll just... right. Well, maybe I will just... I'll just say
by the government which was elected under your leadership.
Right. Let me just then summarise the effect of it, because it dealt specifically as one of the options with this issue of containment. And it described it as a least worst option. If you read the paper, what they're saying is, it's possible it might work, but equally it's possible it won't. But here is the point that I think is really, really important on this, the so-called smart sanctions. That there was then, following that paper, a whole series of government discussions about these smart sanctions. Each of them were indicating that they might work, but they could give no guarantee of it working. The previous regime had obviously not yielded, the previous sanctions framework had not yielded the benefits that we thought in terms of sustainability. And the thing that I think is very important about this is the paper which I think has been declassified, because I think that was just done yesterday, which is about Iraq, the new policy framework. This is the paper on the 7th of March, 2001. And the Iraq new policy framework describes the arrangements that would apply on this so-called smart sanctions framework. And I just want to draw attention to one, because the whole issue about the previous sanctions eroding had been Saddam's ability to get stuff in through the borders of the surrounding countries. And therefore, one very important part of this new sanctions framework was for border monitoring, a limited number of boarding crossings into Iraq from Jordan, Syria, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And so the idea was, in this new sanctions arrangement, to make sure that you sealed off the borders around Iraq so that it was more effective. The important thing to realize is that when we then came post-September the 11th and finally adopted this United Nations resolution, and I think it is United Nations Resolution 1409, the tightening of the borders had been dropped. We couldn't get the Russians on board unless we dropped it. And so the very thing that even back then people were warning me, even with this tightening of the borders, it might work, it might not, that tightening restriction had been dropped by the time you get to May 2002. And therefore, you can still argue, I guess, that this sanctions framework would have been successful. But I think I would say it's at least as persuasive an argument that it wouldn't have been.
But it wasn't, of course, the trade sanctions were only, as I described earlier, one of many elements that comprised containment, that were keeping Saddam in his box. You had some forces stationed in neighbouring countries in the region. The Americans had a lot of forces as a deterrent. We had the no-fly zones. The arms embargo had been fairly effective. The trade sanctions were leaking. Parts of the border monitoring were effective in the sense that there was a naval embargo which we helped to operate through the Armilla Patrol, I think. Other parts were leaking. Was the totality of this containment, I mean, this I think remained the official policy of your government in at least the first half of 2002, but as a strategy, and I'm still trying to stay on the strategic level, did you see this as something at that time, first half of 2002, as a strategy which could be sustained over the medium term? Or did you feel that it was a goner?
Well, what I felt was exactly what I was being advised, and I think the common sense of it is it might have worked, it might not have worked, but it was at least as likely, if not more likely, I would say, that it wouldn't work. And, Sir Roderick, if I just make this point, because I think you very fairly draw attention to the range of different measures. The no-fly zones were causing us difficulty. The trade sanctions were a vital part of stopping him getting material in to reconstitute WMD programs. Because remember, the whole point about this new sanctions framework is that we were going to move from, effectively, we will tell you what you can have in, to a different framework, which is actually in many ways much weaker, of course, which is to say you can have in whatever you like apart from these 300 items on the so-called goods review list. So the trade sanctions part of this, which we know he'd been breaking under the previous regime, was not a peripheral but an essential part of that sanctions framework being valid. And so the problem was, I mean, an accurate summary of the position, I don't think anyone could really dispute this at the time, is that containment through sanctions had basically been eroding. We now had a new sanctions framework, but this new sanctions framework, to get it through the UN, had been watered down in the absolutely vital component of the trade restrictions. And I don't know whether it's maybe worth actually sending you there's a book by someone called Ken Pollock who has written specifically on the sanctions framework and Saddam. And what he does when he comes to this so-called smart sanctions is he said there were 7 preconditions for smart sanctions to work, and then he goes on to explain why none of them would actually have happened. So I think...
Let's just summarise that then, and by all means send us the book, please. We have no shortage of material to read, but we're always ready for more. Containment, therefore, is a policy that is in question at this point. You're clearly, as Prime Minister in the first half of 2002, and based on the advice coming to you, you're not very happy about the way it's working. So what are your other strategic options at this point, and by what process did you review what your options were?
Well, that's the reason we called for the options paper. I mean, the options were basically these. We had taken a decision post-September the 11th that this issue had to be confronted, and there are a number of different ways it can be confronted. It can be confronted by an effective sanctions framework. It can be confronted by Saddam allowing the inspectors back in to do their work properly, and compliance with the UN resolutions, or in the final analysis, if he was not prepared, if sanctions could not contain him, and he was not prepared to allow the UN inspectors back in, then the option of removing Saddam was there. And that option, incidentally, had always been there. After September the 11th, what changed, as I say, was our calculation, mine and I think the Americans as well, that we couldn't go on like this.
So the options paper looked, as you say, at containment strengthened as one broad course, an alternative strategy, possibility of regime change, which by then was being much talked about in the United States, and then 3 different ways in which that might be affected. And I don't want to go into each of those at this particular point. I'm, as I say, trying to think about the process of formulating strategy. Having got that paper, what did you do in order to have it discussed and reviewed and looked at? What kind of meetings did you hold about it? Who did you consult?
Well, obviously we were talking, I was speaking very closely with Jack Straw, with those who were advising me at the time. We were talking obviously to the Ministry of Defence people and the Defence Secretary as well. And we were trying to get an assessment. That's why, as I say, there was a lot of discussion inside government. Is this new sanctions framework really going to do it or not? Is it going to be effective? And as I say, I think the conclusion was, in the end, you certainly couldn't rely on it.
Did you have an actual meeting to discuss the paper and take a decision on it?
Well, we had a meeting, I think. The options paper was given to us before the meeting with President Bush, and then I think, I'm not sure whether it was before or shortly after, but I can look it out for you. I think we then had a meeting, the key people, to decide where we were then going to go. And
I think you got the paper in March, you were seeing President Bush in April, and before you went to see President Bush, you had a meeting at Chequers with a number of people, which was a sort of briefing meeting for Crawford. But you didn't have anything like a cabinet committee meeting that looked at this paper and had a sort of structured debate about it.
Well, we did have a very structured debate with the people. I mean, the fact that it happened at Chequers rather than Downing Street, I don't think is particularly relevant to it. But I think the simple answer is, did we consider those other options? Absolutely. That's why we had the paper drawn up.